Not a plan, just movement. Fast, low, and quiet enough to disappear before anyone could get a clear shot. Behind them, the McSween house collapsed in on itself. Flames pushing through the roof, smoke rolling out into the night, carrying with it whatever was left of the fight. Inside, men were dead. Outside, the war wasn't finished yet because the ones who made it out, Billy the Kid, Jim French, Jose Chavez, E. Chavez, and a handful of others, weren't leaving Lincoln as soldiers. They were leaving as something else, unorganized, unprotected, and already being hunted. They hit the Rio Bonito under cover of darkness, dropping into brush thick enough to break sight lines and swallow movement. No talking, no regrouping, just distance. Because they all understood the same thing at the same time. If you stopped moving, you didn't get another chance. And by morning, Lincoln would belong to someone else. Welcome back, listeners, to Gallows and Gunfights, the series where we examine the men, the violence, and the decisions that shaped the American West. I'm your host, John. In the last episodes, we've followed the Lincoln County War to its breaking point, the 5-day battle, the burning of the McSween house, and the collapse of the regulator positions inside of Lincoln. What came out of that fire wasn't victory, it was fallout. Now in this episode, we're moving into the months that followed, when the war ended on paper, but the consequences didn't. We'll track what happened after the escape from Lincoln, break down the killing of Morris Bernstein near the Mescalero Agency, and examine how Billy the Kid went from a participant in conflict to one of the most wanted men in the territory. Because this is the point where everything changes. Not all at once, but in ways that do not reverse. Now, by the time the sun came up over Lincoln, the fight was already decided. And not because every shot had been fired, but because the balance of power had shifted. McSween was dead, his house was gone, and whatever protection his faction had claimed inside the town went with him. The men who escaped into the night understood that immediately. There was no thought of circling back, no attempt to regroup inside of Lincoln. The ground they had just left behind was not contested anymore. It was controlled, so they kept moving. The Rio Bonito gave them just enough cover to do it. Thick brush along the banks, uneven ground, narrow crossings, terrain that worked in their favor as long as they didn't slow down. Small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 riders, spreading out instead of staying together. Not strategy, survival. Because anyone still inside Lincoln by daylight would be easy to find and easier to take. In the days that followed, what remained of the Regulators did not reassemble into a single unit. They moved outward into the surrounding country. Ranches, line camps, isolated pockets of land that stretched into the Capitan and the White Oaks regions. Places where men might be fed. Places where questions weren't always asked, but nowhere that they could stay for long. They weren't the same group that had ridden into Lincoln under McSween's authority. That version depended on structure, on the idea that they were operating inside of a conflict that gave them purpose and at times legitimacy. And that framework was gone. What replaced it was simpler. They were identifiable, they were armed, and they were now tied to a losing side of a very public fight. That combination doesn't leave much room to operate. Word moved quickly, faster than they could. Dolan's faction did not need to hunt blindly. They knew who had escaped, and they knew roughly where those men would go. Local law, sympathetic to the side that now held Lincoln, didn't have to hesitate either, and Fort Stanton set close enough to matter. The Army hadn't intervened during the worst of the fighting, but its presence limited how openly anything could continue afterwards. Patrols, movement, visibility, all of it added pressure. So the pattern settled in almost immediately. Move, stop briefly, and then move again. Stay ahead of anyone trying to track you. Rely on people that you trust carefully, and don't give anyone enough time to decide otherwise. Through the remainder of July, that's how Billy and the others lived. Not as a unit, not as an organized force, just men moving through ground that they knew, trying to stay one step ahead of men who knew it just as well. And as the days stretched out, the direction of that movement began to narrow. South and west, back towards country that they already passed through months earlier. Mescalero, Blazer's Mill, ground that had already proven dangerous once, now drawing them in again. By early August, some of those scattered riders began turning up again in familiar ground, not as a group, but in the same area. The Mescalero Agency, Blazer's Mill, the South Fork of the Tularosa. It wasn't accidental. They knew the terrain, and more importantly, they had already survived here once, months earlier. Buckshot Roberts had shown them exactly how dangerous that ground could be. Now they were back in it, moving through it in smaller numbers, but still armed, still visible enough to draw attention. At the agency, that mattered. Tension was already high. Reports of gunfire in the area were not being ignored, and men responsible for maintaining order couldn't afford to treat it lightly. On August the 5th, that tension turned into contact. Shots were heard near the South Fork, close enough to bring response from the agency. Morris Bernstein, the agency bookkeeper, rode out to investigate. Now, he wasn't alone. At least one lawman or constable accompanied him, though accounts differ on who exactly was present and how they approached. What happens next is consistent in one respect. Bernstein did not arrive cautiously and withdraw. He engaged. According to regulator witness Atanasio Martinez, Bernstein rode up and fired fast, once and then again, directing his shots at one of the Mexican regulators. He closed the distance as he did it, continuing to fire. That turned the encounter immediately. Whatever authority he carried into that moment disappeared the second that shots were exchanged. What followed was not enforcement, it was a gunfight. Return fire came quickly, and within seconds, Bernstein was down, dead. That part is not disputed. What is disputed is everything around it. Who fired the shots that killed him? From what position? At what distance? Some accounts hold to Martinez's version that the man Bernstein was advancing on returned fire and killed him directly. Others introduce a different possibility, that the constable riding with Bernstein fired the fatal shot, whether through misidentification, angle, or confusion in close quarters. The terrain doesn't help clarify it. Brush, uneven ground, movement, nothing about that environment supports clean reconstruction. Positions shift depending on who's telling it, and distances rarely align from one account to the next. What can be placed with more confidence is Billy's position in the moment. He was there, but not fixed in one spot. During the exchange, horses spooked. Riders lost control of their mounts. In that disruption, Billy ended up on foot, moving and not holding ground. George Coe rode in fast enough to reach him, and Billy climbed on behind him, the two of them leaving the scene bareback without stopping to stabilize or regroup. That sequence matters because it places him inside the encounter, but not at the center of the shooting. When it was over, Bernstein's body was found where he fell. His pockets had been turned out, his guns taken. That detail would carry weight almost immediately because it allowed the killing to be framed in a way that went beyond a confrontation, not just a shooting, a robbery. And once that framing takes hold, it doesn't require precision. It requires attribution. Billy the Kid was the most recognizable name connected to the group. And that was enough. A grand jury would eventually indict him for Bernstein's murder, formally and on the record. And unlike the confusion at the scene, that part was clear. The charge stayed. After Mescalero, there was no attempt to pull the group back together. What remained of the regulators moved as fragments, pairs, small clusters, sometimes alone, circulating through a wide stretch of country that ran from Lincoln down through the Bonito, across Capitan, and into the rougher ground beyond. They didn't stay in one place long enough to be fixed. That was the point. A night in one camp, a meal at a ranch if it was offered, and then gone again before daylight made them easy to track. The pattern settled quickly. Travel light, avoid roads, stay off anything that could be watched, and don't let too many people know where you'll be next. Because once word started moving, it moved faster than they could. Some of that movement depended on cooperation. Ranchers, line riders, men who had taken sides during the war or simply didn't trust the ones now in control. Those were the places that you could stop without immediately being turned in. But that kind of help was not guaranteed, and it wasn't unlimited. So when it wasn't there, they took what they needed. Horses mostly, because without a horse, you don't move. And if you don't move, you don't last. That made every camp temporary, every stop conditional. Nothing fixed, nothing stable. At the same time, the ground that they were moving through wasn't neutral. Lincoln had changed hands, and that mattered beyond the town itself. Men aligned with Dolan didn't need to search blindly. They knew who had escaped, and they had a general sense of where those men would drift. Local law wasn't hesitant either, not anymore, and Fort Statton set close enough to limit how openly anything could be done. Patrols didn't need to be constant to matter. The possibility was enough. So movement wasn't just about distance. It was about timing, where you were at night, where you weren't by morning, and who might have seen you in between. Through the rest of August and into September, that's how Billy and the others operated. No fixed camp, no central base, just a loose orbit of ground they all knew well enough to move through without slowing down. They would cross paths and then separate again, circle back through the same regions days or weeks later, depending on what pressure was the highest. And over time, that pattern creates something specific, not invisibility, familiarity, because the same ground gets used, the same routes get taken, the same people get relied on. And once that starts to repeat, it can be followed, not immediately, but eventually. And that's the trade. The land keeps you alive, but it also keeps you within reach. By the fall of 1878, Billy had options. Not good ones, but real ones. Men left the territory all the time, south into Texas, west into Arizona, north into Colorado, far enough away, and the names tied to Lincoln didn't carry the same weight. Warrants didn't disappear, but they lost urgency. Recognition dropped off. A man could start over, or at least operate under less pressure than he would face staying in the same ground. And Billy knew that. He had the experience, the connections, and the ability to move. And yet he didn't. He stayed in the same region, within reach of Lincoln, within reach of the same people, and within reach of the same system that was building a case against him. That decision stands out, especially when you look at what the others did. Some stepped back, some moved on, some reduced how visible they were and let the situation settle around them. Billy didn't follow that pattern. So the question isn't whether he could have left, it's why he chose not to. Part of that answer is practical. He understood that terrain, not just the geography, but the structure of it, where the water was, where you could move without being seen, which routes could carry you through a stretch of country without crossing paths with anyone who might talk. That kind of knowledge is not interchangeable. You don't take it with you to a new territory, and without it, you're operating blind. Depending on people you don't know, moving through ground that you haven't tested, without any way to judge how long you can stay ahead of anyone that's looking for you. Leaving does not remove risk. It just changes it. And in some cases, it increases it. But that only explains one part of it, because there's also the question of position. By the time the war ended, the narrative had already shifted against him. The same system that had given him limited authority had reversed course and placed him on the other side of it. Leaving the territory would mean accepting that shift completely. No contest, no challenge, no attempt to influence how the story settled. Staying, on the other hand, kept him inside of it, inside the same region, around the same people, within reach of the same events that had defined him in the first place. That doesn't make the decision safer, but it does make it deliberate. And when you look at the pattern, where he moves, who he stays connected to, how he continues operating, it's consistent. He is not drifting. He's choosing to remain where the stakes are the highest. There's no statement from him explaining it, no record where he lays out the reasoning. What exists is behavior. Opportunity to leave, ignored. Pressure increasing, accepted. Same ground, reused. That kind of pattern doesn't answer every question, but it does narrow them. Because whatever the reason, practical, personal, or something in between, it's the same decision that keeps him in the path of everything that follows. Now, as this period settles in, one name keeps reappearing alongside Billy's, and that's Tom O'Folliard. And depending on how the story is introduced, that name doesn't always carry the weight that it should. As we saw in Young Guns, he's often reduced to something much smaller, a kid, a follower, someone drawn in by Billy's reputation rather than someone shaping what came next. That version does not match the record because Tom wasn't new to this by the time Lincoln fell. He'd already been through the fighting. He had already moved in the same circles, on the same ground, under the same conditions that filtered out anyone who couldn't keep up. And after the war, he didn't step away. He stayed in it too. Not at the edges, right alongside Billy, consistently enough that his presence becomes part of the pattern rather than an exception to it. That kind of continuity is important because this isn't an environment where men drift in and remain by accident. If you stay, it's because you can operate, move when needed, hold position when required, and make decisions without hesitation. And Tom fits that profile. He's not being carried, he's contributing. And over time, that shows up in how the two of them function. Not as a fixed pair in every movement. This kind of life does not allow that. But as recurring alignment, they separate when it makes sense, move through different areas when needed, and then come back into the same orbit. Days apart, sometimes longer, but tied to the same network, the same ground, and the same direction of movement. That's not coincidence, it's structure. Now, by the time this loose circle begins to take shape into what would later be recognized as Billy's gang, Tom's role is already defined by that consistency. Not the most visible name, and not the one that the story centers on, but the one of the few who remains in place while the others step away. And that's where the distinction matters, because a lot of men who rode through Lincoln don't continue forward in the same way. They settle, relocate, or reduce how exposed they are. And Tom doesn't. He stays inside the same pattern, inside the same risk. And that makes him something more than a supporting figure. It makes him part of the reason that the pattern holds together at all. Because no one operates in this kind of environment alone for long. Not successfully and not repeatedly. And when you track where Billy appears through this period and who appears with him, Tom O'Folliard is there often enough that it stops being incidental and it becomes expected. On November the 13th, 1878, Governor Lew Wallace issued a proclamation intended to bring formal closure to the violence that had defined Lincoln County for most of the year. It wasn't a reaction to a single event. It was a response to accumulation, months of killings, competing factions operating under shifting claims of authority, a local system that had failed to maintain control long enough for the conflict to resolve itself without outside intervention. And by the time Wallace took office, the situation didn't require interpretation. It required stabilization. And the tool that he chose was amnesty. The proclamation itself was structured to cover offenses tied directly to the Lincoln County conflict, specifically those committed between February 1st and the date that it was issued. Within that window, participants on either side were offered protection from prosecution, provided that they stepped away from the violence and returned to civilian life. In principle, it was broad, and deliberately so, because anything narrower would have failed. The conflict had involved too many people, too many overlapping actions, and too many blurred lines between what could be considered enforcement and what could be considered retaliation. A selective pardon wouldn't have ended anything. It would have prolonged it. So the language was written to absorb the majority, but not all. The limitation built into the proclamation was clear, and it wasn't incidental. Anyone already under indictment was excluded. That clause didn't exist to clarify the offer. It existed to define its boundaries. Because by drawing that line, Wallace accomplished two things at once. He gave the territory a way to move forward, allowing most participants to step out of the conflict without fear of prosecution, while preserving the ability to pursue specific individuals whose involvement had already been formalized within the legal system. It wasn't just a peace measure, it was a sorting mechanism. And by November of 1878, Billy fell cleanly on the wrong side of it. His name was already attached to active charges stemming from the war, including the Brady Hindman killings, and the investigation into Bernstein's death continued to circulate through official channels. That connection only added to the weight that already was attached to him, which meant that when the proclamation was issued, his status did not change. He wasn't eligible. He wasn't covered. And there was no provision within the language that allowed for reconsideration. The offer simply didn't apply. Now, for many of the other men who had taken part in the conflict, the situation looked much different. If their actions had not yet resulted in formal charges, if their names had not been entered into the system in a way that required prosecution, they could step back across the line. Not necessarily clean, not necessarily without suspicion, but without immediate legal exposure. And that distinction had practical consequences. It allowed those men to return to work, to settle into ranch life, to reduce their visibility without carrying the same level of risk. Over time, that transition mattered more than the proclamation itself, because it created distance between those who could reintegrate and those who could not. Now, Tom O'Folliard sits directly inside that contrast. He had been part of the same conflict, present in the same environment, moving through the same aftermath, but there is no clear record placing him under any kind of indictment at the time that Wallace issued the proclamation, which means on paper, he had a path available. He could have stepped away, could have reduced his exposure, could have allowed the situation to settle without remaining inside of it. But he didn't. He stayed aligned with Billy, inside a position that the proclamation had already defined as outside the protection that it offered. And that decision highlights something that the proclamation itself makes unavoidable. From this point forward, the divide isn't about sides in a war. It's about legal status, whether your name exists inside the system or outside of it. Now, Billy's name was already there. And once it is, the structure around it doesn't dissolve. It just builds. Indictments don't expire quietly. They don't fade away with time. They remain active until they're resolved, either through the courts or through whatever means the territory uses to enforce them. So while the proclamation marked an endpoint for the conflict on paper, it didn't resolve the position of the men that were excluded. It clarified it. It established that whatever came next for them would not be handled as part of a broader conflict. It would be handled individually, case by case, charge by charge. And for Billy, that shift matters more than the proclamation, because It removes the one thing that had allowed him to operate inside the war: context. From this point forward, there is no larger structure to absorb what happens, no conflict to explain it away, no ambiguity to soften it, only the record. And the record is already in place. So once the amnesty was in place, the shift wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Men began to separate, not in a single moment, not with any formal break, but through decisions made over days and weeks that added up to something permanent. Because once there was a way out, the question became simple. Do you take it or do you stay where you are? And for many men who had ridden through the Lincoln County War, the answer was practical. They stepped back into what the territory offered when it wasn't at war: cattle work, ranch labor, positions that didn't require constant movement or constant exposure. George Coe is a clear example of that shift. Wounded during the conflict, he returned to stock work, and he eventually lived out his life as a rancher, known more for his recollections of the war than for anything that followed it. Frank Coe, his brother, followed a similar path, still connected to the past, still recognized for his role in it, but no longer operating in the same way, no longer moving inside the same level of risk. Doc Scurlock, arguably one of the most capable men involved in the fighting, did not remain in that same environment either. He pulled away from the center of the conflict, eventually leaving New Mexico altogether and building a more stable life elsewhere. Frank Waite returned to Indian Territory and moved into politics. John Middleton, severely wounded, did not re-enter the same world after the war ended. Henry Brown would go on to other roles, lawman, and then later outlaw again, but not part of Billy's circle in New Mexico during this period. Jose Chavez y Chavez continued his own path, remaining a significant figure in the region, but not as a fixed part of what Billy was building in the months and years that followed. None of these men disappeared, but they stopped moving in the same direction. And that distinction is important because what remained around Billy wasn't a continuation of the Regulators. It was something much smaller, more defined, and far less forgiving. And at the center of that group were two men who did not step away: Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Bowdre. Their names don't just appear occasionally, they reoccur in movement, in association, in the places Billy is documented to be. They are not incidental companions, they are constants. That consistency becomes more important as time goes on because the structure around Billy isn't expanding, it's tightening. The group that remains isn't large enough to absorb losses. They can't absorb mistakes, and they can't handle exposure the way that a broader faction could. It depends on reliability, on men who can operate independently but return to the same orbit without disruption. O'Folliard fits that. Bowdre fits that. And as this smaller circle begins to take shape, other names move in and out of it. Dave Rudabaugh, an outlaw by trade rather than a product of the Lincoln County War, joins later, bringing a different kind of experience into the group. Others, Billy Wilson, Tom Pickett, and additional writers whose presence is less consistently documented. They appear at different points, ride for a time, and then separate again. But those men are not the core. They are the additions. What defines the group is who remains when others leave. And that number is small. That reality stands in contrast to the way that this period is often portrayed. A larger, more unified band, the same men continuing forward together as if the war simply shifted locations. That version does not hold because the war didn't carry forward as a unit. It broke apart. And what followed was not an army. It was a handful of men moving together because they chose to, staying together because they accepted what came with that choice. Because by this point, remaining in that circle means something specific. There is no expectation of stepping back into ordinary life. No assumption that things will settle enough to allow a quiet return. The amnesty drew that line. And the men who stayed with Billy did so knowing exactly which side of that line they were on. And that changes how the group functions. It's not temporary. It's not transitional. It's now been defined, not by size, but by commitment. And that's what carries forward from here. Not the Regulators as they existed during the war, but the smaller, more focused group that remains after it. So after the proclamation, the territory began to settle into something that looked stable. Offices were filled, courts resumed normal function, business resumed where it could. From a distance, it gave the impression that the conflict had run its course and that whatever remained would fade with time. But that stability was uneven because it depended on who you were. For men who fell inside the protection of the amnesty, the change was immediate enough to matter. They could return to work, move openly, and allow the past to become something discussed rather than something enforced. But for those outside it, the conditions were different. Nothing reset. There was no transition where one phase ended and another began. Instead, the same situation carried forward into a quieter environment. And that quiet made it more noticeable. Through the final weeks of 1878 and into the early months of 1879, Billy remained in the same general range. Lincoln, the Benito, the Pecos corridor, moving through ground that had already become familiar. The pattern established earlier didn't change. Short stays, constant movement, limited contact, but the context around it did. Because without the distraction of an active conflict, attention narrowed. Reports that might have stayed ignored earlier were now recorded. Sightings that might have been dismissed carried more weight, and information moved through channels that were functioning more consistently than they had during the fighting. That didn't produce immediate results, but it changed the environment that he was operating in. The same movement that had allowed him to stay ahead of immediate danger now had to account for something slower and more persistent: documentation. Not every encounter resulted in action, but more of them were noted. More of them were connected. And over time, that kind of accumulation begins to matter. At the same time, Wallace's administration continued working through the aftermath of the war. Reports were coming in, formal and informal, about killings tied to the conflict, including the Bernstein case. Correspondence moved between territorial officials and federal representatives, building a record that extended beyond Lincoln County itself. Publicly, the message remained consistent. The war had ended, order had been restored, but privately, there was no assumption that every participant had been accounted for. There were still men at large, still armed, still tied to unresolved cases. And Billy's name appeared often enough in that context to remain part of the ongoing discussions rather than something that was left behind. On the ground, that translated into a kind of sustained pressure. Not constant pursuit in the sense of daily contact, but a narrowing of tolerance. Less space to operate without notice. Less flexibility in where and how long he could remain in one place. That shift didn't produce a defining event during these months. There are no major, well-documented gunfights tied directly to him in this window. No single moment that marks a clear transition. Instead, what defines this period is continuity. The same pattern repeating under conditions that are gradually becoming less favorable. Movement, evasion, reliance on a shrinking circle, and time, because time in this context isn't neutral. It doesn't reset anything. It adds to what already exists. Charges remain active, records expand, connections become easier to make, and eventually that accumulation forces a change, not from outside, but from within, because continuing in the same pattern stops being sustainable. Not immediately, but predictably. And By the time this period reaches into early 1879, that realization begins to take hold, not as a single moment, but as a shift in direction. Because for the first time since leaving Lincoln, staying in motion isn't solving the problem, it's maintaining it. And that distinction is important because it's what leads to the next decision. One that doesn't come from pressure alone, but from the recognition that the current path doesn't lead anywhere different. So by early 1879, nothing about Billy's situation is improved. What had changed was how clearly it could be seen. The charges against him were not new. The names attached to those charges were not new. But what was new was the absence of anything that could offset them. There was no active conflict to absorb the responsibility, no shifting authority to complicate jurisdiction, no uncertainty about who controlled Lincoln or how the courts would respond if he were brought in. Those variables had settled, and when they settled, his position became fixed, not in motion, not in question, defined. That definition didn't depend on where he was on any given day. It followed him. Because once a name is tied to multiple indictments, entered into the record, carried forward through official channels, it stops being tied to location. It becomes portable, recognizable, transferable from one report to the next without needing to be reestablished. And that changes the equation. Movement still matters, but not in the same way. It can delay contact. It can avoid immediate confrontation, but it doesn't reduce what's already attached. It doesn't diminish it. And it doesn't create an alternative outcome. That's the part that closes in. Not distance, not terrain, but structure. Because by this point, the structure around him is complete. Local authority is aligned. Territorial leadership is engaged, and documentation is in place. And the distinction created by the amnesty is no longer theoretical, it's operational. Others have stepped back into legal life. He is not. Others can reduce exposure. He cannot do that without addressing what's already been recorded. That leaves only a narrow set of possibilities. Continue as he is, operating inside the same pattern with the same limitations, allowing time to add to what already exists. Or change the approach entirely, not by leaving, not by disappearing, but by engaging the system that has already defined him. Because at this point, there is only one place where that definition can be altered. Not in the field, not in movement, in negotiation. And that requires something that he hasn't attempted yet, direct contact, not with local law, not with men who would act on existing charges, but with the one person who has the authority to affect them, Governor Lew Wallace. Now that shift doesn't happen suddenly. It doesn't come from a single incident in this moment. It comes from accumulation of charges, of time, of constraints that don't loosen, until the pattern has been operating inside, stops offering anything different. And when that happens, the decision isn't about survival anymore. It's about outcome. Because surviving without resolution only carries you forward into the same position again and again and again until something interrupts it. So by early 1879, that interruption becomes necessary. Not inevitable because of one event, but because every other option leads back to the same place. And from here, the next move isn't made on horseback. It's made with words. Before we close this one out, I want to take a second to point you in the right direction. If you're listening on a platform that lets you follow or subscribe, make sure that you're following the Dark Dialogue Podcast Network. That's where everything that we produce lives. Every show, every series, all in one place. But just as important, Gallows and Gunfights has its own dedicated feed on every platform. If this is a series that you're locked into, make sure that you're following that directly so that you don't miss anything as this story continues to unfold. If you're listening on YouTube, this series lives inside the Gallows and Gunfights playlist on the Dark Dialogue channel. So make sure that you're subscribed and keeping up there as well. If you want to support what we're building here, the best way to do that is simple. Follow the show, leave a rating, share it with someone who actually appreciates this kind of storytelling. You can also support us directly through Ko-fi, Patreon, Substack, all linked in the description. That support goes directly back into the work, research, production, and continuing to tell these stories the right way. And as always, some men outrun the law, none outrun the rope. And out here, nothing stays buried.